In our reading of Genesis chapter 3, we're going to turn first to the account of the disobedience, verses 1 to 7. And because this chapter is longer than the material we typically read, we'll probably not go into quite as much detail as we normally would, only try to pick out those things that are most significant or distinctive in the text as we move through it from a grammatical perspective. So we begin with verse 1. V'hanakash haya arum mikol hayat hasadeh. And the snake, nakash is the normal Hebrew word for serpent or snake. Snake is the more common English term, so I'm going to use that. The snake was arum. Now, this word arum is very interesting in terms of what it does in the text. And to get at that, let's first turn back to the last verse in chapter 2, verse 25. There we will read that the two of them were arumim. This word arumim is an adjective, arom, from the third verb spelled ur, ayin, wow, resh. The verb means to be stripped or to be unclothed. Arom as an adjective means naked. But that's the word in chapter 2, verse 25. In chapter 3, verse 1, we have what looks like the same word, but isn't. The word here is the adjective arum, not arom, but arum, and it's from a different verb. It's from the verb aram, ayin resh mem, which means to be prudent. So as an adjective, arum means prudent or crafty. You say, these words look the same to me. How do you know they're different words? And the answer is, if you look very carefully, you can see the dagesh forte in the mem of the word in chapter 2, verse 25, arom. That dagesh tells us that we're looking at the word arom rather than the word arum. The plural of arum would be arumim, but without the dagesh in it. Here it's the singular, so the dagesh doesn't show up anyway because it would be in the last letter of the word. But that's how we know that these are two different words. Going back to verse 1 then, the snake was crafty or clever. Mikol chayash hasadeh. Most English translations would say more clever than all the animals of the field. Notice, however, that chayath is singular. So because it's singular, I would personally read this, the snake was more crafty than any of the animals of the field. Than any animal of the field. Animal, singular in this case. Asher asa Yahweh Elohim, which the God Yahweh asa, made or had made. Here's a good example. In first year Hebrew, you may have learned that the perfect aspect of the verb can be translated by any past tense as the context requires. Here, asa is perfect, but we probably would translate it in English as a pluperfect, because this is action that God had performed before the action that's being recounted in this narrative. So the snake was more crafty than any animal of the field which the God Yahweh had made. Vayom el ha'isha, and he, that is the snake, said to the woman, Afki aram Elohim. The word afki might deserve just a quick comment. The word af by itself is often a conjunction used to mean also or moreover, but it's frequently used in a different way as an emphatic participle. That is to say, it serves to emphasize something, and when it's used this way, it's frequently combined with ki, as we have it here. Now, the interesting thing about this passage as we look at it is that what we're looking at, in form at least, is a statement of fact, not a question. So if we were initially approaching this, we would probably read, he said to the woman, God has really said, or God has indeed said. But most English translations, as you know, translate this as a question. So how do they justify translating it as a question if on its surface it's a statement rather than a question? Well, there are two aspects to this answer. The first aspect is to remember that not all questions are marked as questions in Hebrew. That is to say, we have interrogative particles like ma, meaning what. We also have the hey interrogative, which marks something as a question. But it's not necessary in Hebrew to have any of those in order to ask a question, just like it's not necessary in English. For example, if I said to you, "You're really going to give me $1 million?" You could tell by the tone of my voice that that was intended to be a question. And if we wrote it out on paper, though, it would look like a simple declarative sentence. You're really going to give me $1 million. But the inflection of my voice tells me or tells you that it's a question. The same thing happens in Hebrew. You can have something that is a question that's not marked as a question. If it were being spoken, the inflection of the reader or speaker would tell you it's a question, but there's nothing in the text to mark it as a question. That's one possible aspect of why we might read this as a question. But there's another as well, because the editors of Biblica Hebraica actually believe that this is a case of haplography. Now, just a quick reminder, what is haplography? Haplography is a mechanical error that happens when a text is being copied. By calling it a mechanical error, we mean that this is something that happens by accident. It's not something that's an intentional change on the part of the reader, the copyist. And it also doesn't necessarily reflect a difference in the underlying text, particularly if you're looking at Greek translation. So a haplography is something that happens when a text is being copied, happens by accident. And what happens in haplography is that you have two letters that are the same, or two letters or words that are very similar, or a group of letters or words that are very similar, that because they're similar, the eye of the copyist will skip over the second one, and so a letter or a phrase or a word can be accidentally omitted or left out. So haplography is the accidental omission of a word or words, typically because there's repetition or a very similar looking or sounding letter or word nearby. That's what haplography is. So what is it here in this case? What specifically is the issue? If we look at the text, I've highlighted in green the last letter of the word for woman, ha'isha. And notice it's the same letter that would be used for the hey interrogative. So what the editors suggest has happened is that the original text looked like this. They had two heys together. And keep in mind that there were no spaces between words in manuscripts in this period. And so these two would be immediately following as you see them on the screen here. Also then, in the process of copying, at some point, a copyist accidentally omitted one of the hey letters, and the text is subsequently missing this letter. So the editors believe that's what happened, and they're possibly right. This could well be a case of haplography. But even if it were not, and you can never prove one way or the other that it was or wasn't, but even if it's not, the context tells us that we really have to read this as a question. So remember, not all questions are marked as questions, And in this particular case, we may have an instance of haplography that leads us to look like it's a statement, although in the context, we will certainly read it as a question. So he said to the woman, "Is it really the case that God said, Lo tokalu mikal eitz hagad? You, tokalu, will not eat," or here we probably would read this as a modal imperfect, "you must not eat." Or remember, lo tokalu could be, since you never use a negative particle with an imperative, you have lo used with the imperfect or al used with the imperfect to communicate an imperative idea, depending on the strength of the intention. So, like the Ten Commandments, some of which have this same form, lo plus the imperfect, you could read this as a command: do not eat from any tree of the garden. So the snake says to Eve, did God really say, do not eat from any word of the garden? Or we might read it, did God really say, you must not eat from any tree of the garden? Again here, notice eitz is singular. So here, kol could be any or every. In this case, we might translate it either way. And given the Eve's answer, we might prefer to translate it every. Did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden, or don't eat from every tree in the garden, or any tree in the garden? Did God really say that? The serpent asks. We get Eve's answer starting in verse 2. Vatomer ha'isha el hanakash, the woman said to the snake, B'pei fe'etz hagan nokel, from the fruit of the tree of the garden. And here eitz may be intended as a collective, trees of the garden, even though it's singular. Nokel. Nokel is a call, imperfect, first common plural, from the root aleph, kaf, lamed, akal, to eat. And you say, well, what's this holum here? I was confused by that. And remember that in certain first aleph verbs, this holum shows up in the call imperfect. We have it at the beginning of the verse in the verb amar, to say, and people get really used to seeing it in the word amar, and it doesn't confuse them anymore. But when they see it in another first aleph verb, it can sometimes be confusing. So nokel is simply the call imperfect, first common plural, from the verb to eat, akal. Eve's answer continues in verse 3. She had said, from every tree, or from the tree of the gardens we may eat. Every, I think, is understood here because of what follows. Pri ha'etz asher bitok hagan. The wow at the beginning of this verse is disjunctive. It introduces an exception. But from the tree which is bitok hagan. Here, tok, this is a noun, tawek, which means middle or center of something. But from the tree which is in the middle of the garden, or in the center of the garden, Amar Elohim lo tokalu miminu. God said, lo tokalu. Here again, I think I would take this as a modal imperfect, read it like a subjunctive. God said, you must not eat from it. So, again, here, God is instructing them on what they should do. That they don't is another matter, but here they're being instructed. Her answer continues, Walo tigabo. Tiga is a call imperfect from the verb nun, gimel ayin, naga, to touch. Actually, it's a fairly common verb. Notice the object is marked by a beith, bow. So you must not or ought not to touch it. Pin tumuthun. Pin introduces a negative result or something that you don't want to happen. Usually in English, if the effects are open to question whether it's going to happen or not, it's not something that's currently happened or has happened in the past, but something that might happen in the future. We usually translate it in English with the word lest. So you must not touch it lest you would die. Again, reading the imperfect tumuthun as if it were modal imperfect, a subjunctive, lest you should die or might die. Verse 4, Vayomer hanakash el ha'isha, so the snake speaks again to the woman, and what he says to her is, Lo moth tamuthun. Here we have an infinitive absolute, moth, preceding the indicative verb tamuthun. Let's just quickly review. When you have an infinitive absolute before a finite verb, which is what we have here, basically you're dealing with one of two possible ways of highlighting something. One is to express the notion of certainty, in which case we would translate, you will not really die. You won't certainly die. You won't really die. So that would be one way of handling it. The other way of handling it would be to see the infinitive absolute as communicating the idea of doing something to a maximum or extreme degree. So in that case, we would read something like, you will not die completely, or you will not utterly die. Well, in the context, probably the notion of certainty fits better than the notion of doing something to a maximum degree. So we'd probably read this, you won't really die. You won't certainly die. Verse 5 then continues. The serpent is speaking, remember. Ki yodea Elohim. Here, there are a couple ways we could take this ki. Remember, the most common use of ki is to introduce an explanatory clause. You will certainly not die because God knows. But it's not the only way. For example, we could read this as an adversative or as an alternative. You will not die, but rather God knows something else will happen. And the third way that we might read this would be to read it as an emphatic. You will not die. Surely, truly, God knows. Then with what follows. So all of these three work. Some English translations take it as explanatory. Others take it as adversative or offering as an alternative. I'm not sure off the top of my head if there's one that takes it as emphatic, but it would certainly work grammatically in this context and in the context of what's being said if one were to read it that way. So, God knows. What does God know? Ki bayom akalkim mimenu. Here, the key is different from the one we had just 3 words back. That key introduced either an adversative idea or an emphatic idea or an explanation. This key introduces a different kind of clause. It introduces what we would call indirect discourse. Indirect discourse is the description of something that's said or thought rather than an actual quotation. In English, an actual quotation would be something like, I said, I'm going to the store, in quotation marks. Indirect discourse would be, I said that I was going to the store. I've described what it was I said, not given you the exact words. So here we're not talking about speech, but we're talking about knowing, and indirect discourse is often used with verbs of perception or mental processes as well. So God knows that bayom, here the preposition beith indicates temporal nature, and we could translate this literally on the day that you eat of it. Or we could translate this more generally simply as when. In favor of the more general when translation is the fact that here we don't have a definite article under yom. Under the base. We simply have a schwa. In a day that you eat from it. So I'm inclined here to read this in the more general sense of when, generally, and not focusing on the specificness of the day, although actually that's true also. So when you eat of it, then nifkaku. Here, this is a nifal perfect from pakak, which means to open. It's third masculine plural. I call that to your attention because the subject, the word following, enekim, is one of those words in Hebrew that sometimes dealt with as if it's masculine and other times dealt with as if it's feminine. Hebrew, as you know, doesn't have neuter nouns, but it has sometimes nouns that are treated as masculine and sometimes treated as feminine. The word ein, because it's a body part that occurs in pairs, is often feminine, although here it's treated as masculine. It's matched up with a masculine verb. This is just one of the peculiarities of reading Hebrew that makes it so joyful and fun, and not such a tedious burden as reading Greek would be. So here, default perfect third masculine plural, with eyes as the subject. Your eyes will be open, and you will be, or become here, because of the comparative kaf on the next word. You will be, or you will become, kelohim, like God. And in what respect will you be like God? Yodei tov wara. Well, here, some English translations will take the Elohim as plural. You'll become like the gods or like divine beings, knowing good and evil. That's certainly theoretically possible. As you know, Elohim is plural in form, although it's usually used of Israel's God with a singular sense. I would be inclined to take it that way because it's used clearly of God in the singular in a few verses before. For God knows that when you eat of it. So because it's used that way previously, I'm inclined to take it as a singular usage in terms of meaning here as well. So God knows that you will become like God, Yodei tov wara, knowing good and evil. Knowing is a call participle, so it doesn't have any time element. Here we'll just take it as, in effect, an ongoing present. You are someone who knows in an ongoing way. Tov wara, good and evil. There's a lot of discussion about how we should understand this. If we were doing a class on Genesis, we'd spend a bit of time on the alternative interpretations of what it means to know good and evil. Is this a reference to having moral judgment? You'd have the ability to distinguish good from evil, or is this simply good and evil as an idiom for representing everything? Just a way of saying you would be omnipotent. Well, we'll leave that, since our goal for this exercise is just to read the Hebrew, not to debate its interpretation. Turning now to verse 6. Vatere ha'isha, the woman saw, ki tov ha'etz lamakal, what did she see? Here again, indirect discourse introduced by ki. The woman saw that good was the tree, lama'akal. Here, this word makal is a noun for food, comes from the same verbal root, aleph, kaf, lamed, to eat, but the noun, the mem in front of it, makes this a noun. it was good for food. She saw that it was good for food. In other words, that it was edible is, in effect, how we might translate this today. The woman saw that it was edible, and she saw waki ta'awahu la'enaim, that it was ta'awa. This word ta'awa is not all that common. It means a desire or delight. And notice the pronoun who after it is basically functioning like the verb to be, as it often does, that it was a delight to the eyes, in other words, it was attractive. So the first thing she sees is that it's edible. The second thing she sees is that it's attractive. It's lovely to look at, beautiful piece of fruit. And then she sees a third thing. Nechamad ha'etz lahashkil. Nechamad is a nifal participle, masculine singular. It's from the root chet mem daleth, chamad, which means to desire something or to delight in something. No, this is virtually a synonym for that noun that we had in the previous clause. Ends up meaning the same thing, although that's a noun. This is a nifal participle. Here it's descriptive. So she saw that it was attractive to the eyes, and that it was nechamad, and the tree was desirable, ha'etz, the tree was desirable, lahashkil. Notice the parallel to the form with a lamed preceding this. We have kind of the same idea here. Not only was it desirable to the eyes, but it was desirable here we have an infinitive construct, a hiphil infinitive construct, from the verb sakal, which means to be wise or to prosper. So it was desirable, hiphil, in order to make wise, or to make one wise. So three things Eve sees about this. First, that it's attractive to look at. First, that it's edible. Second, that it's attractive to look at. And thirdly, that it offers something desirable. It offers the possibility of gaining sakal, or wisdom, insight. This is a word that's used quite frequently in wisdom literature. It's used outside wisdom literature, but it is an emphasis in wisdom literature. So we have a little bit of taste of wisdom thought here, that it was something that was desirable to make one wise. And so what happened? Watekach miprio, watokau. She took, here from lakak, first lamed. Remember, it behaves like a first nun verb. So tikak is second person singular, call imperfect, from lakak, to take. She took miprio, some of the fruit, preposition min on the fruit. She took part of the fruit or some of the fruit, and she ate it. Watitein gam laish ima wa'okau. And she gave it, here natan, looks very much like the first lamed verb lakak in form, because again lakak is behaving like a first nun verb. So she gave it also to the woman, la'isha. To her man. Here, the hey on the end, I almost misread this as a feminine. This is a possessive suffix. She gave it to her man, or her husband, ima, with her. Now, this word ima, with her, again, I don't want to wander into too many interpretive issues here, but some have argued that Adam must have been standing right there beside her and heard the serpent say all these things to her, and not, was kind of passive and not taking any activity in this situation. That's not actually required by this, even though the word ima might suggest it. Because remember, the narrative that we have here, there's no indication of how much time passed. So the man was with her when he gave the fruit to him, but it doesn't mean that he was necessarily with her when the other actions take place, because we don't know how much time takes place between them. Now, you'd think the way it looks, the way it's described, these are actions that follow upon one another immediately, but that's not necessarily the case. If I said to you, I went to Israel and I came back, that wouldn't necessarily give you any sense that I spent 8 weeks in Israel before coming back. It sounds like I just went there and I came straight back. But that needn't be the case. So when there's no time frame indicated clearly by the text, you have to be careful about overreading it and insisting that a time element on a time element when there's none actually in the text itself. So it's possible that Adam was with her, but the text doesn't say it as clearly as some people suggest that it does. So he gave it to her husband, her man, who was with her, and he ate it, I think would be understood here. Finally, wrapping up this section, or this segment with verse 7, Watifkachna ene shenehim, Watikachna, this is a nifal imperfect, third feminine plural. And again, I point out the subject, the next word after it is the word for eyes, ain, eye, enaim, usually dual, here plural. The reason I mentioned this is just a couple of verses ago in verse 5, we had the same word I being used as a masculine noun. Here we have it being treated as a feminine noun because the subject of the verb is feminine. Tifkachna, feminine plural. The eyes of the two of them. Shenehim. Here we have the number, Shanaim, two, plus a suffix, the two of them, or we might say in English, both of them. So don't say both of their eyes were opened, because that sounds like you're talking about two eyes on the same person. This is the eyes of both of them, or more literally perhaps the eyes of the two of them were open. Why yeda'u ki erubim heim. Here, erubim heim. They knew that they were erubim, naked. Now notice there's a tremendous irony here. And we set this up by pointing out that at the end of chapter 2, we have this word arom, naked, versus arum, crafty, in verse 1 of chapter 3. But notice the irony here. Eve saw that the fruit was desirable to make her wise, but they weren't made wise. They even weren't made arom, crafty or clever. Rather, they were made arum, naked. Now, I'm going to translate this naked. I'm from the southern part of the United States, and if you grew up where I grew up at the time that I grew up, you would know there's a difference between being naked and being naked. Being naked is when you're in the shower and you don't have any clothes on and you're taking a shower. Being naked is when you're in the shower and everybody else can see you in the shower without any clothes on. So naked is a simple fact. Naked is an awareness that it's a state of mind. It's a recognition of exposure, if you will. And that's what's happening here. They were already naked. So they already saw that they were naked. What they understood now wasn't just that they were naked, but that they were naked. That is to say, there was a difference that had been introduced, some new element that makes their life in relation to one another and in relation to God different than it had been before their act of disobedience. So now they're alienated from one another, and this alienation is the first immediate, the sense of alienation is the first immediate result of the fall in terms of human experience anyway. But there's a tremendous irony here in this use of the word arum crafty earlier, after arum naked at the end of chapter 2, the repetition of arum naked here in this context, after saying that Eve desired it to be made wise. A tremendous bit of literary irony going on in this passage that escapes us when we read it in English. Watifra'u ale to'ena. And so here the verb tafar, this looks like it might be a hithpael of a word, the yith at the beginning, but that's a deceptive thing. The tau in this case is part of the root. Tafar only occurs 4 times, means to sew or to bind things together. And so they sewed ale. Ale is the word for foliage or a leaf. It can be a leaf in the singular, or it can be a collective noun meaning something like foliage. Here we probably take it as foliage because we're talking about more than one leaf. Another possibility is that if we look at the textual apparatus, the editor suggests that we might read this with another word that's pronounced the same but written differently. Ale, it's the same word, just a construct plural instead of the absolute singular. So maybe this was just a mistaken copying and they intended the construct plural. There's a lot of textual evidence for that. As you can see, there's some Hebrew manuscripts, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, the Targums, Targum Jonathan of Genesis in particular, and the Vulgate all read it as a plural. Now, it may be that they had a Hebrew text in front of them that had an actual plural, or it may be that they're just following the sense of this as a collective. We can never know. It doesn't actually change the meaning in any way. But here there's a possibility of a copyist error in the text at this point. So we'll just take it as a collective, a singular used as a collective. They sewed together the foliage of the ta'enah. Ta'enah is a word that means fig tree. So they sewed leaves of a fig tree together. By the way, this is why in Jewish tradition, the fruit that Adam and Eve ate was not an apple, but was a fig, because figs are mentioned here in the text, and it would seem to make sense that they took the leaves from the tree that they had just taken the fruit from, and sewed them together. So in Jewish tradition, these are fig leaves, not leaves of an apple tree. Either way, I don't know that we can be categorical about it one way or the other. But certainly there's nothing in the text to suggest apple. By the way, where did the tradition of an apple come from? It comes from the fact that the Latin word for apple is malus, M-A-L-U-S, it would be spelled, which looks very much like it's the same word meaning evil. So there's a little play on words there. The apple, the fruit was an apple because it was evil. It was a malus. That's why in English we have the tradition that this was the fruit was an apple, even though the text doesn't say what kind of fruit it was, unless it was a fig. I'm inclined to go with the Jewish tradition here and take it as a fig, not an apple. But do as you like. Finally, verse 7 ends up, after they sew the leaves of the fig tree together, what did they do? Ya'asu lahem hagoroth. They made for themselves, here the lamed is kind of a lamed of interest or an ethical dative. They made for themselves, the haim here we'd take as reflexive, even though Hebrew doesn't have a true reflexive particle. They made for themselves hagoroth. A hagorah, we don't really have a great word for in English. Belt, hagorah is a belt sometimes. That wouldn't seem to make sense in this context. We often translate this loincloth. The problem is loincloth is also a bit of an inaccurate thing. How would they make a loincloth out of leaves being sewn together? We just don't have a good word in English to translate this. If you're looking for a word to translate it, it might be the Japanese word mawashi. A mawashi is the garment that sumo wrestlers use. And although you can't tell, it's actually just one long strip of cloth that is wrapped around the appropriate parts and then tied. And because they're sewing together leaves, we're probably talking about something that's just a straight line, if you will, of material, leaves that are then wrapped around. So probably the closest word we have would be a mawashi, although if you translated that, nobody would know what that was either. So you'd have to explain one way or another. Loincloth is probably the best you can do in English, unless you want to go with something like even more generic, like undergarments. That would probably work also. Well, that's a quick look at the account of the disobedience in verses 1 to 7. In our next segment, we'll carry on with the encounter between Adam and Eve and God.